Hi, and welcome to Magic Number. This is episode number 40, and this week we're dealing with the Archetypist, the Streets of New Capenna edition. And if you don't know what Archetypist is, you have to wait for probably a couple of minutes when I will explain everything about it. But for now, let's start with my preamble. And my preamble this week is bandwagoning and magic is real. And I came with that idea because I think that early opinion about particular things in magic are very easily rooting in the community, and it's sort of this thing like with a Nickelback. Everyone hates Nickelback and think it's a terrible band, but in fact they're just a very serviceable C minus grade rock band that plays bangers. Some of them are probably good, if not very inspiring songs. But someone somewhere said that Nickelback is lame, and probably they didn't use the word lame because that's also lame. And the opinion of Nickelback as being a terrible band has been born. And I think that a lot of that has been going in Magic recently. It's like Magic players are very opinionated, they have strong opinions, they like to share them. And if a particular opinion reaches a certain number, it's awkward not to agree with it. And I think that such an opinion was a part of Streets of New Capenna. I think that Streets of New Capenna, by no stretch of imagination, was it a great set, but it wasn't a bad set at all. It had some build around potential. There was a color disproportion, but we've played many sets with color disproportion that were quite serviceable. I think that some game patterns were not perfect, but it was not bad. I mean, compared to things like Dominaria, which I personally found quite atrocious, and I'm not afraid of sharing that opinion with the rest of the world. I think that the set was perfectly serviceable with replayability, um, and I think the early disappointment of some content creators generated this opinion that SNC was not a good set. I'm probably going to be quite happy to replay it when it hits on the quick draft, or when we get it as a premier draft as a returning format. I'm quite happy uh, to be playing it. Um, and yeah, I think that we should maybe not jump this bandwagon when we see the opinions of content creators. It's so easy to just fit in and jump on this poor set and bash it all the way around. But when you think about it, too much bashing, especially when it's not super strongly merited, is going to generate disinterest in the format, and that's to our own disadvantage, because fewer people playing draft means fewer people interested in draft, which means basically detriment our own game. I'm not saying that we should sugarcoat it for the WotC and not say what mistakes were made and what we think was not working correctly, but I think that just dismissing a format because it was not perfect is, it's a bit harsh. Obviously, there were better sets in the recent years than Streets of New Capenna was, but there were also worse sets. I think that AFR was much worse in terms of the disproportion in power level, and some decks were absolutely unplayable. I think that it was also a bit too rushed to call it a two-color format when it was supposed to be a three-color format. I think that the numbers don't support that conclusion at all. I think that the three-color decks had really good win rates if you built them correctly, and by that, if you prioritize the fixing for the three colors properly. I think then the win rates of three color decks were non different from the win rates of the two color decks, which is something that is really, really different from the previous formats where three color decks were markedly worse than two color decks. So I think sometimes it's worth to step back and think: are we bandwagoning here? Are we just bashing on a format because it's an easy target, or are there any merits? And I think in this case there is a mixture of both of those things. But I think that only one side of the mixture was represented in social media. Anyway, with that, I'm going to try to explain what Archetypist does. And to start, I need to explain basically what I do as a job. I mean, I'm an ecologist. I study ecology, and ecology studies interactions between species in an ecosystem. Now, ecosystems are complex networks of multiple species. At school you probably learned something about plankton fish and predatory fish and birds that feed on fish and how they are connected in those complex networks. I do the same with bacteria, which is maybe less more imaginable. There's a bunch of blobs and they all interact with each other, but when you look under the microscope, you might not be able to see it. But ecosystem can exhibit some measurable functions. So for example, if we have a bacterial ecosystem, some biomass production can be a measurable function of it. And also, we can measure this function in many cases. And if we measure this function, we can assess the health of the ecosystem. And by doing that, we can actually draw some conclusions on what are the key species. If you manipulate those ecosystems, you can figure out what will happen if I remove that particular key species. Does the ecosystem function still as well as it did before, or does it have some kind of a loss of function? Now, you can use the same thing in Magic, basically. So Magic decks are interactions between cards in a metagame, just very much like species interact in the ecosystem. Decks are complex networks of multiple card types, and whenever you draft a deck, you try to build it according to some kind of rough blueprint, and you have cards that are absolutely crucial for that particular build. You have some cards that are maybe rewards for being in a particular deck, and you also have cards that are absolutely not fitting into the particular type of deck, and if you put them, you probably are harming your win rate. Talking about win rate, decks can exhibit a measurable function, and that function is a win rate in many cases. Now, if you look at an individual deck and measure its own win rate, it might be not so much telling because there is a variance that plays into it. But if you do it over and over again with hundreds of them, you can actually measure a particular function. So decks of particular type have a higher win rate. Then by analyzing what cards are in there, you can actually come up with some links between particular cards and the win rate. And based on that, you can figure out what are the best builds. By measuring win rate, we can assess power of a deck. So basically very much like the function of the ecosystem and its health. And by doing that, we can draw conclusions on key cards and key combination of cards and key themes that you will put in sort of pockets of synergy or something like that. Now, in ecology, we do compare different ecosystems. So can we do the same thing with decks? And I think yes, to some extent, and there are some drawbacks of this method, and maybe some things are not particularly easily catchable in terms of figuring out how they work together. But we can cluster decks together based on their composition similarities, very much like I do in my actual day job. And then once we cluster them based on the similarity of the composition, so we know which ecosystems are similar to each other or which decks are similar to each other, we can assign secondary traits onto them. Like, for example, we can look at the win rate. And we can basically look if the decks clustering together have a high win rate or low win rate. And that's the whole idea behind the Archetypist. To give you an impression of that, this is a blob of 2000 decks that are converted into numbers based on their composition and then plotted in a two-dimensional space, because our human brains are very good in dealing with two-dimensional spaces, but not in infinite dimensional spaces like those blobs are naturally made when I actually convert them to numbers. But what it means in here is that the closer the two dots are, the more similar the two decks are. So for example, if we have these two decks, they are quite similar in their composition. When we have this deck and this deck, they are very, very different from each other. And I think that this is a comparison of some decks from Kaldheim when they did the analysis first, like one color combination. So we can see that there is this core of denser blobs, which means that probably these are more canonical builds. And there are some rarely populated spaces, which means that there's something weird is going on there. Maybe these are the decks with some splashes. Maybe these are the decks that use underutilized strategies, and so on and so on and so on. So how do I get from that blob, because this blob doesn't tell me very much, except for the fact that some decks are more similar to the others, into something useful that I can actually start drawing any conclusions from? And to do that, I decided that the good strategy would be to look at the local win rate of a particular deck group. So I can check the average win rate of each deck and its neighbors, because as I told you, looking at the win rate of one deck is too much prone to something like variance. You just got paired up with better players, you got paired up with decks that were particularly good against you, and all of a sudden a decent deck will go like 1-3 or something. Or you just like were super lucky and you were paired with the weaker opponents and you go 7-2 with a deck that probably was not that strong. It can happen. But because you look at the neighbors, you can expect that the chance of that happening over and over again is much lower. So the aggregated win rate of the deck and its neighbors should be a better proxy for the success in a particular cluster in that blob. And we can apply it to the plot that I showed you before. So basically, this is how the looking at the average win rate of 15 closest neighbors looks like. I take I take a deck A, and basically I look at the 15 closest blobs on the plot, and basically calculate how many games were won with those decks and how many were lost. Calculate the win rate done, and then I can take the same for the deck B, and also look at the 15 closest neighbors of it and calculate it what the win rate was of the nearest neighbors. And basically, these two will have different win rates, although they're not going to be very drastically different because they share quite a lot of their neighbors because they are next to each other. So basically, they share 11 of their neighbors, so basically themselves plus 10 more neighbors, and they have the differences in those four that are a bit further from each other. So if these four decks were super winning and these four decks were all O3s, there is going to be some difference between those two spots. It will mean that basically uh, this deck maybe is more successful because it's more closely related to those. So when we look at the similarities in composition, these things are the places where we want to look for successful builds, successful combination of cards and whatnot. While these ones are probably decks that tried to be like the red deck but didn't quite make it, and there were some things that inside of that particular cluster that didn't work so well. So if we look at the differences between them, we can actually figure out what is causing those differences, and maybe drop some hypothesis on why one thing worked and the other didn't. Right. So I lost my window. There we go. Let's go back to that then. So if we apply those win rates on the blob, there are several possible scenarios on how it can work. So for instance, here I manually assigned win rates on the decks basically at random, and that's what you can see on the plot. So you have those blue decks that are great decks with a high win rate of them and their neighbors. Red ones are underperformers, and you see that they're sort of randomly assigned all across the board. So this scenario would technically be possible if a particular color combination is not very well defined, and it's all depending on players' skill and not much on the card power. But that's not what we expect. We expect that there are better cards and there are worse cards in a particular format. And there will be decks that contain more good cards, and they should be the good decks that win more, because if they have more good cards, they will be winning. And because of that, decks that will have more good cards will also be closer related with each other because they have similar composition, because they have all those good cards in them. So we expect sort of some kind of clustering inside of this blob, where we will find better decks and worse decks. There we go. So this is another possible scenario, and this is also like data that I built by hand, where I basically made one blob of successful decks. And this is a possible scenario that from the archetype, there is one particularly good build that has particular characteristics that will be linked together, and these builds are really good, and the rest of it is just not doing as well as the rest. So So yeah, that's one of the possible scenarios. I don't think that this is going to happen very often. Most of the time, you'll get at least several of those clusters of good builds. And depending on how far they are from each other, it will be also that there are some very similar good builds, but slightly different. Maybe there's a nuance, and maybe we can read it from the data. And maybe there are some quite drastically different decks that are good. Um, and then we can actually look at how you can draft a particular archetype with that in mind. So which cards you want to prioritize in which version of the deck. So yeah, that's hopefully what we're going to see in the data when we dive into the Archetypist. Yes, and as Isaiah mentions, this would vary a lot based on the format, and also in the it will vary quite a lot, I think, on the based on the number of colors in the deck, because how the maths is applied to those clusters. If you have different mana bases, it will be much more different, and free color decks have also are taking from a much wider pool of cards, which means that they have the capability of having multiple builds that are very different from each other. So hopefully, I've actually I didn't have time to look properly through the Archetypist data yet because we just did it yesterday. But I'm hoping that in some multicolor combinations we will see quite drastically different builds where we can actually see what was the focus, which color pair was the focus of the three color deck, and which was the support color for them. So hopefully we can see that later. Okay, so this is all fine, but it always took me ages to figure out. But then I started collaborating with Pekka Pulli, a magic aficionado, but also a person who does a lot of data visualization, and he develops tools for apps, and is really good at that. And he offered me to help with the Archetypist, and actually came up with the name. I'm pretty sure I didn't figure that one out. And now we are at the stage of our collaboration where I produce the data, send it to Pekka, and all of a sudden everything appears, and it's a pretty useful toolbox that you could also use yourselves. So I think that without further ado, I don't have anything else in there. I can try now to go directly to Archetypist, and we can start looking at some decks and just basically chatting on what was going on in Streets of New Capenna and use it as a sort of sunset show in my case. So I'm going to stop the screen here, share a different screen. Can we do that? Yes, we can. So this is the Archetypist. I will put a link to it in the chat. So if you're interested, you can also explore things on your own. And if you look at it, this is a plot of 1,000 recent blue-white best-of-1 decks in Streets of New Capenna. The decks come from players with at least 50% win rate and are ranked platinum or better, so when they were played. So I decided this time to focus on players that are at least above 50%, and players that play in the higher grades, because that, I assume, means they are more invested players. So I filter a lot of decks from lower grades that might be winning, but not because they are good decks, but because they were played against maybe opponents who are still beginning to learn how to play limited. So this deck is given value according to the win rate of it and its 19 closest neighbors. And it's always this kind of blob that I'm showing you, but the top 10% of the decks by win rate are highlighted in blue and bottom as light red. So you can see that there's, for example, some clusters of decks that are not performing so well. And interestingly, lots of those decks are on the peripheries, which means that those underexplored builds maybe are underexplored for quite a good reason, because they are not as successful. And the cool part of the tool is that, at least on the computer, I don't know how it works on the mobile, because I'm a boomer and I use computer as boomers do. Yeah, you can play around with this. So basically, you can look at the supermost, the 1%. So we will already see that this is the cluster where the most successful decks lie, and it increases. New clusters appear when you show those decks from the top 10%. And you can go as high as you want. So basically you can see how it populates the solution space when you add more and more successful decks. So like these are the decks above the average, and these spaces are where not so successful decks are lying. You can see the. Can you see the cursor actually on the when I move it? Hopefully you can, because it's a sharing of the screen. So yeah, but 10% is a decent size because we have some decks in there, but we also don't have too many. So we hopefully will get better information. I will use the 10% as a sort of default. And you can click the button to filter the top decks. So basically we remove everything else, and that will be good for me to start looking at the clusters. And to look at the cluster, you just need to basically go over it, and we can check a couple of clusters and see what's cooking inside of them. Here we have some weird cluster on the peripheries, and here we have another on the peripheries, and here we have another on the peripheries. Okay. So as you can see, I highlighted some of those clusters, partially based on whichever of those clusters were appearing first. So so we have those decks, and highlighting this cluster does something in the software. So if I scroll completely down, here is our cluster 0, so the first one that I looked at. And we can see what is the average wins of decks in that cluster, what is the number of those decks, and what are the most played cards, and also how they compare to the average of played in these color combinations. So you can see this cluster looks like some sort of connive version of the blue-white. We have Raffine's Informant as the top card. There's an average of 1.2 copies per deck of that card. That's slightly more than the average for the color combination. Expandable Lucky is well almost equal with the Raffine's Informant, but importantly, there is much more Expandable Luckies played in that build than on average, which makes me think that this deck wants to connive and then hopefully discard the Lucky to get the +1/+1 counter, get the fish from the graveyard. So you have those kind of combinations in there. Also, Echo Inspector is overrepresented, so that feeds into those connive synergies. It looks like there is some pressure to have flyers, which is not something unexpected in the white-blue. So we have Overseer. Obviously, you want to have Overseer in your deck anyway. It has roughly on average of Majestic Metamorphosis and Celestial Regulator. It has overrepresentation of the Skycrier. There is Hold for Ransom in there as well to stop being killed on the ground. But importantly, yeah, there's like Obscura Initiate, which is nice. But for example, the deck doesn't really want Backup Agent that much. So there's fewer copies of Backup Agent than in the average deck. Oh, Sanguine, there's some kind of a packet of unhighlighted dots surrounded by cluster 0, 1 to 3. Would you care to figure out what happened there afterwards? Sure, we can do all of that. That's the whole point. And there, on top of that pretty useful ability, yeah, I have no idea why does it say Iceland. It must be some kind of my translating settings of Chrome. I updated my Chrome and then it started showing Island, but I see now it reverted to Iceland. And of course, it might be because Pekka is from a Nordic country. He does support his Nordic brethren from Iceland and wants them to get some kind of highlight in the program. Oh, that's a good one. That Iceland is an island. That's true, and also snow-covered island. I'm afraid it doesn't exist in this format. But without digression, you can see some example of 7-win decks, and you can scroll through them and see what made them tick and what was in there. But basically, there is plenty of trophy decks in that particular cluster, so it seems to be pretty a successful one. So we can go slightly up. Cluster 1, also 4.8 wins, 20 decks, so very similar. This is the white was open cluster, it seems, because there is at 1.4 inspiring overseas on average in a deck. Also, Echo Inspector is overrepresented. I think that Echo Inspector is probably a good proxy for blue being slightly open. So this is like one thing that comes from those analyses all the time is that if color pair was open, the decks are better at winning, and they have particular cards that indicate that the color was open. And I think here, Inspiring Overseer and Echo Inspector are serving this one. But unlike in the previous cluster, Backup Agent is showing up as being overrepresented compared to the average blue-white deck. And we have lots of the same cards. So we have the Raffine's Informant, Lucky, Skybridge Tower. Good fixing is helping you win. And also having access to Skybridge Towers indicates that there might have been some blue-white open. Another card that appears that is overrepresented to an average blue-white deck is Obscura Initiate. And this tells me that this card might have been slightly underappreciated by a 17 lands user and not played as often as it should have been played. So yeah. So is there a cluster of dual lands versus Searchland in the 7-win decks? I have no idea. I would have to check. Well, I mean, maybe it's pretty poor, but damn sure was overrepresented in some decks that were pretty good at winning. And I'm not saying that this is a card that made or break makes or breaks your blue-white deck, but I think that it could be quite useful to play it. Thank you for the raid, Matt Moses. Always nice to have you here. But let's go back to the Archetypist. We're talking about the builds for different archetypes in Streets of New Capenna. Here we have a slightly poorer win rate cluster, but still 4.3 on average is not bad based on 17 decks. And this is the cluster where you have Celestial Regulator, a lot of Majestic Metamorphosis, where this looks to me like blue-white in particular was open, but maybe blue and white were not open themselves. So we have a lot of Celestial Regulators because no one was interested in Azorius 2-color cards. But we see Echo Inspectors and Inspiring Overseers being slightly less available. So yeah, that was probably it. It has much more of the ground force here with the, well, Roughing Informant was always there, but Backup Agent is also overrepresented. We have Brokers, Veteran, Dapper, Shieldmate. So it's not full on flyers, because probably those flyers were not available. And weirdly, there's few expendable luckies in this build, but maybe it's because you don't have as many Echo Inspectors and Raffine's Informant luckies were not needed in those particular decks. But yeah, that's another one. Here, another small cluster. And well, let's look where cluster number 3 is. Cluster number 3, it's slightly above the 1, 2, and 3. Has a high win rate, very high win rate actually, 5.1, so very much like the cluster 0. And this one, again, Echo Inspector, Raffine's Informant as the top cards, but then it also has a lot of Backup Agents and Celestial Regulators. So this one looks like it was really, really open. It doesn't really happen very frequently. It has a lot of Obscura storefronts, so it focuses on fixing. Maybe there's some splashes in some of those decks, quite possibly. What else do we have here? Hypnotic Grifter appears as an uncommon, which is a strong signal that it was played quite a lot in those decks, because of course uncommons are going to be slightly less visible. As you can see, most of the cards in the list will be commons because they are just so much more frequent in the draft. So if you see an uncommon on the list, it means that it was really important for the deck. And you have like 0.6 copies of Hypnotic Grifter per deck here. So roughly, well, 1 in 2 decks has at least a copy of that. And do we have any 2-color cards here? I don't see them. I don't see them as such. So still two color decks, but with a decent fixing. Yep. Now that deck looks sweet. And all-seeing arbiter to top it up. So that was the clusters 0 to 3, and these are all clustering close together, so they should be relatively similar, with maybe with a slightly different flavors of each other. Now cluster 4 is very different, and cluster 5 is really different, so hopefully we can see something different there. Let's look cluster 4. And here we have much more interaction. So this is the sort of like more tempo-y version of the archetype, with top card in those decks clusters. They have 4.7 wins on average based on 11 decks that we analyze. Top card is Make Disappear, the 2-mana counter spell. Second card is Run Out of Town. So clearly we have some interaction in there. Then we have things like Dapper Shieldmate, which is quite high, which I assume that if you have a lot of interaction and the Dapper Shieldmate hits as the first creature, you can run out of town their blocker, start attacking for 4, and push damage like this. This cluster seems also to have waterfront districts, which suggests to me quite strongly that there is a black splash involved in those decks. Also, Obscura Stormfront is quite high copy numbers. So I think that these are blue-white decks with a black splash, and we can try to see if that's the case in the 7-win deck lists. And in fact, the first one that I look at it has 2 Obscura Stormfronts, 2 Swamps. So I assume there's some black cards. There's also Maestro's Theater in there. Oh, there's Obscura Charm. Oh, there's Raffine in there. Oh, look, another Raffine in there. So at least 2 decks that we looked have Raffine in. This one also has 2 Swamps, but no Raffines. Let's depopulate. But depopulate in that deck shows you that this is the kind of a deck that wants to have some sort of interaction theme. And the third one doesn't have Raffine, but also has Swamp. So these all decks in that cluster, they have Swamp. So these are the blue-white decks that splash black for one reason or another. But you can see already that just clustering with Mats, we are able to pinpoint on that cluster that splashes black. So is this one going to have green splash? Cluster number 5, another very different one. Instantly, I can see that there's a lots of copies of Botanical Plaza. So these will definitely be the blue-white decks that also splash for green. And also, I see that there is 0.7 copies of Disciplined Duelist in those decks. So probably most of them, they do splash for Disciplined Duelist and just play the regular blue-white strategy, but with a Disciplined Duelist to help pushing damage through. But not so many green cards in it, so it's not enough to be treated as a full 3-color deck. Like this one has Lagrella, for example, not a Disciplined Duelist, but probably some other ones in that. Oh, this one has 2 Disciplined Duelist. So this one is based on 11 decks and clearly is a broker splashing green. And the last cluster only has 3.7 wins per deck. So this is probably a least successful one. It also has Botanical Plaza, but it's a worse version of blue-white that splashes green. But we can see that easily from the data that this one splashes using Sparrow Adjudicators, that they have 1.5 copies on average per deck. And it has also the Botanical Plaza, but no Disciplined Duelist inside. So probably they were splashing, but not for the cards that should be splashed. If I would be gambling that kind of a guess, they were splashing for Sparrow Adjudicators because they were easy to put in the deck. And I think that the lesson from here is that probably you didn't want to do that. You wanted to splash for thing that really makes a difference, like Lagrella or a Disciplined Duelist. Right, so we had the blue-white. Someone requested that we look at some cluster of cards that was close to 0, 1, 2, 3. Can you tell me which cluster you wanted to look at? I think that we sort of highlighted most of the cards here, so I don't know exactly where you wanted to look into. And we can come back. We can come back to that later. So let's look at the blue-black. And here we have definitely several clusters. Let's look which cluster is the original one, where the clustering starts. Oh, that's an interesting one. We have two clusters quite far from each other. That okay. So this one and this one are the top clusters. So let's look at this, and let's look at this, and let's look at that one, this one, and this one as a possible. Yeah, four I think is in five. Five I think is enough. We might look at the this one, but this one already covers quite a lot of space, so those decks might be not so similar to each other, and yeah, might be a fluke. Let's see. Um, a sanguine. Okay, we'll look in the central region of the blue-white in a second. But let's look first through the, because I already made the clusters, let's look first through the blue-black. So the cluster 0, the one that has the first decks that appear in the tool. Main card, Stooping Newsy. I think that if you play blue-black, you should have access to as many copies as you can possibly do. Girder Dragoon's the second most popular card, Corrupt Court Official, Crooked Custodian, Echo Inspector. So sort of like mid-range-ish, aggro-ish, but it definitely has too many glamorous outlaws, the Maestro's Family Fixers, not to consider that some red was played in those decks. So probably this is like blue-black, maybe splashing some red cards, and let's see if that's the case. There is a mountain in at least 3 of the 7 win decks. So there is some splash of red. Usually those splashes are going to be for high rarity cards, so we can't expect them appearing in the actual data here. But there is Cormella, Glamour Thief in one of them. There is Hostile Takeover in the other. I was expecting to see Hostile Takeover, another Hostile Takeover. So it's basically blue-black, usually splashing something pretty strong in red. There's a Strangle in there for what it's worth. So yeah, first cluster already showing you that splashing red was not such a terrible idea. Cluster number 1, slightly further away, Snooping Newsy. Again, lots of copies of that because the card was underdrafted. So if you picked the blue-black lane, you should have access to as many as you can. We have Girder Goons. Weirdly, Maestro's Initiate is one of the top cards in there. So that's the 3-1 that you can play from your graveyard and draw to discard one. Make Disappear, Rooftop Nuisance, Crooked Custodian, Expendable Lucky, Fake Your Own Death. So it's a bunch of death triggers combined with some or death useful abilities after the creature is dead, combined with some casualty cards. It's a slightly different build, and this one looks to me like it's well, straightforward blue-black without any splashes. As we see, 8 Icelands, 8 swamps. That indicates to me that there is nothing in there of another color. Although there isn't Xander's Lounge, but that probably is just played as a regular land. Quite a lot of the successful decks have a bomb or two, so I can see the All-Seeing Arbiter. Unfortunately, bombs are happening so rarely that they will not impact the clustering sufficiently to see like, oh, I have a cluster of All-Seeing Arbiters, but you might see a cluster of, for example, Hostile Takeovers in the blue-black decks because if they have a splash of red, it's very likely they're splashing for a Hostile Takeover. But this is like looks like a normal blue-black, but I think compared to the average, it has more of the Maestro's Initiates, more Rooftop Nuisance, more Broker Veterans, and Psychic Pickpockets. So like menial creatures that either prolong the game, trade well, or something like that. It doesn't look very impressive, but it has a 4.6 wins on average, so very much like the previous one, previous cluster. Cluster 2, yeah, lower win rate, 4.4 wins in that cluster, 18 decks. I think, yeah, you see again the cards that you would expect. Snooping Newsy, Expendable Lucky, and Corrupt Court Officials are the top three cards. Nothing is really underrepresented. I mean, you have fewer Fake Your Own Deaths in Waterfront District, but that doesn't tell much. Again, there is Glamorous Outlaws, slightly overrepresented, so and Maestro Theater is there, so we might expect also seeing some kind of a mountain in at least some of them. There's 2 mountains here. There's 0 mountains in the other 7-win deck. Here there is no mountain at all. So maybe some of them have a splash, some of them don't have a splash. And let's look at where the cluster is on the cluster map. Oh, and it's nicely fitting between the cluster 0 and cluster 1. So it will be sort of transition between those two. Some of them will probably play the family fixers, but without playing anything red really, and some of them will splash a red card, and I already saw in one case it was the Hostile Takeover. So cluster 3 should be quite different, and it actually has quite a high win rate, 4.8. Again, Snooping Newsy, roughly what you expect. Girder Guns is quite there. So there is Obscura Storefront in abundance, which means possibly splash for white. And then you have some Fake Your Own Deaths, which is more than you would expect from those decks. The size of the circle means the actual win rate of the deck. So the large circles are probably trophy decks. You can, I think, you could at least at some stage figure it out. But if we just cluster this one as cluster 5, that's a one deck. It has 7 wins. So you can basically look at individual deck if you feel like doing so. But from looking at this, Obscura Stormfront is overrepresented, so I would assume that this one splashes white most of the time. There is a plains in all of them so far, and they splash for, what do they splash for? Extraction Specialist here. Nimble Larcenist splash. So these are not 3-color decks by any stretch of imagination, but they have something from one of the colors, and they all have a plane. So these are the blue-black decks that have at least 1-2 white cards in it. And last cluster, 4.5 wins on average. Few newsies, but there's plenty of Obscura Stormfront, so I have the same kind of idea. It has, interestingly, a lot of Backstreet Bruisers. That's something. Oh, and Broker's Hideout. I wonder, this might be some group that still splashes white, but slightly differently. I guess that Broker's Hideout in here is just to have a fetch land for 2 lands, basically. But we have Mage's Attendant in one of the decks. We have Quiza, Augur of Agonies in the other, and there may be Tolu's Clever Conductor. So yeah, that's basically some sort of Obscura variation that is slightly different from the first version that we looked at. Yeah, quite a lot of Syndicate Infiltrators, but quite a few Snooping Newsies, which is a weird combination for me, because if I remember correctly, Syndicate Infiltrator is the 3/3 flyer that can become a 5/5 if you get your 5 different casting costs in the graveyard. Right. Let's go back to the blue-white, and maybe Sanguine can tell me which cluster were they thinking about. Was it this one? If it were this one, then I would assume that anything in the center will be very similar to each other. This is a sort of 4 or 5 different flavors of the same kind of build, almost, with maybe slight differences in which color is dominant and which cards were opened in the pool that the players were able to get their hands on. So that might be why the differences are there. the unhighlighted group to its left, like this one or this one. Oh, okay. Oh, you mean the decks that were not having high win rate, but were there. This one. Is that the one? Hopefully we can get through there. It's still quite a high win rate actually for those decks, which you would expect because they are sort of basically in the middle of it. Is there anything special in there? Not much. There's plenty of out of the ways. The win rate is actually better than some cluster with the good decks. So it's by no stretch of imagination, it's a bad cluster. Like let's look at the what would be considered a bad cluster, like here. Let's see how many. That's average 3 wins. That's much different. Like, and you can see, like, looking at the bad clusters, fewer celestial regulators than you would expect, more backstreet bruisers, fewer Raffine's informants, fewer backup agents, fewer make disappears, fewer majestic metamorphosis. Uh, half of the inspiring overseers that you normally would get. So yeah, this is basically someone tried to force blue white, but the color was just not open, and you can see that in the results. So yeah, there you go. Even though some of those decks will still trophy, but lots of them will be just close to a train wreck. Okay, let's look at the black red. And let's filter to the top decks so that it's easier to highlight. But let's see where it all starts. Okay, so we have those two clusters. Oh, whoa, where am I going? Where am I going with that? We want 10%. Okay, so here you can see that those clusters are slightly all over the place. It will be interesting to look at them, but because they're slightly all over the place, the similarities maybe are not going to be so close. But this is the original cluster, and this is the second original cluster. So let's look into that. And this is the weird large cluster, but looks like there are some successful decks in it. And we have this one, and possibly I'll highlight this one, just even though it's only 4 decks. KLT says dumb question, which there is no such thing as dumb questions. Do the positions on the scatter chart meter something axis, or is it just similarity difference of the decks? So I didn't do it this time. They don't mean anything that I preset. So basically, I run the analysis, and it will slightly randomly arrange those dots. Depends on how I run them. It's sort of partially random in that aspect, but there are some trends on those blobs. So, for example, if I look at the at this one, I don't know it here, but I mean, this side might be more black, and this side might be more red. So that's something to look at. And I think the next time I'm going to run it, I can run a sub-analysis when I can apply some kind of environmental variables on those decks. So, for example, average casting cost, or number of mountains, or number of swamps in the decks. And then I will be able to generate vectors where you can basically show the vector with an arrow here, and it means that in this direction there is on average more swamps in the deck. So that would mean that this area of the blob is going to be more heavy on the black, and this area of the blob will be more heavy on the red, for example. So I'm going to try this kind of stuff and maybe do them for many different variables, and based on that try to figure out what are the driving forces between the strength of each archetype. I didn't do it in this case because I thought, okay, it's the last week of the format theoretically, so there's not going to be so much interest. I'll try to do the Archetypist earlier for the next set, maybe not for the Baldur's Gate one, but for the September one. And then we can actually start looking at the blobs not only as a blob, but also as a blob that has some kind of directionalities, and I can pick the more interesting vectors and we can apply them on top of the Archetypist. Also, hopefully by that time, Archetypist is not going to be a standalone tool, but it will be available on the 17 lands. So let's see that. Okay, let's look at those clusters quickly. I'll filter the top decks so that we don't get too much noise in there. Okay, so the cluster 0, top card, body dropper. Again, something that you probably should get as many copies as there are opened in the pod when you draft the color combination. There is the Mayhem Patrol, Plasma Jockey. So actually, it's quite heavier on the red in that cluster because first proper black card is Girder Goons. Again, 1.3 copies per deck. We have Strangle, Light Them Ups. Again, red cards. So I think that this is the sort of the version of the red black that is heavier on the red, and you don't see it actually from the basic land combinations, but wow, the 12 lands, what are they play like loads of tramway stations. So it's also all of those decks have the ones that were particularly successful in this cluster had multiple copies of tramway station, which something that to think that maybe this black red needs really good fixing to be successful, because they have on average 1.6 tramway station and zero point 0.9 maestros theater and zero point 0.8 riveteers outlook. So they have at least 3, if not more, dual lands for themselves. Oh, even Ziatra's Proving Ground managed to get there, and Xander's Launch. Oh, look at those people having all the fixing. It's amazing. But yeah, this looks like a slightly more red tinted version of the black red deck. Let's look at the cluster 1. Again, Body Dropper, by far the most abundant card, 2.2 copies on average. So that card was essential for this particular build. Here we have also Plasma Jockey, Girder Goons, Mayhem Patrols, all the Blitz creatures again. This is something to think. Then Strangles, Corrupt Court Official, something that you're quite happy to sacrifice later in the game. And Crooked Custodians, but there is not much interesting there. There is some Waterfront District, so maybe those decks were splashing something blue. Let's look if there is Icelands in there. I see some Icelands. Yeah, there's Icelands in a couple of those decks, so there might have been a blue splash in those in this cluster. Splashing for, let's take a look at it. Corpse Surpriser here. Must be something blue. Avon Heartstabber, Avon Heartstabber. So there are some blue cards splashed here and there. This one also has an Iceland. So that's basically black-red version of the splashed Maestro's decks. They have a decent win rate, and the number of decks is large enough to tell that this was a successful cluster, probably. Cluster number 2, average wins 5, so this is probably the place to be. Body Dropper and Girder Goons in abundance in all those decks. Again, a lot of tramway stations, Mayhem Patrol, Riveteers, Outlook, so again, splashing, and possibly splashing for something green. Is that possible? Much fewer Plasma Jockeys than the average deck. Let's look if they have forests. Yes, they do have forests. And they splashed here for Elegant Entourage, some Masked Bandits, Mr. Orfeo. Plenty of cards in that list. But this looks like this is the black and red sack deck that has some Riveteer synergies. An average of 5 wins. That's probably the most successful cluster in black red, which means that splashing green, if you got a couple of those really, really powerful green cards, was not such a terrible common thing to do. What do they have here from? Oh, here they have actually Echo Inspector. So there is also an island. Yeah, wow. That's a general splashing there. Not only green. Oh, wait, did I scroll to the wrong one? Yes, I scrolled to the wrong one. No, here we have also island. Wow, why did I have an island here? They just had an island. Strange. At least I don't see any blue cards here. Oh, Maestrus Charm. Okay, they have a Maestrus Charm. They split an island. Oh, got seven wins. Explode Thing says that. Do you think my heuristic for amount of body droppers is correct? Like Mercury, top duels are worse in other formats and better in others. SNC has a lower number of one drops you actually want to play on curve, and the game usually begins on turn 2 most of the time. That's a good heuristic, I think. I also think that's a good heuristic that you had a very good way of planning your turn 3 to play another 2 drops. So if you have multiple body droppers, you can play second body dropper on turn 3, play a tapland, and you're quite happy with that. Hopefully that's the one. Cluster 3, 4.5 wins on average, 11 decks. Again, Body Dropper is the top card, Mayhem Patrol, Girder, Goons, Plasma Jockey. These 4 cards seem to be the skeleton of every red deck. And I think that, Body Dropper and Girder, Goons as a must, Mayhem Patrol and Plasma Jockey as a can rather than a must. And these ones also have a couple of islands splashed in, so that's like a different flavor of the Maestro Splash. And the last cluster number 4, average 5.8 wins. So basically, most decks in that cluster, trophied actually. And there's like a load of body droppers and girder goons. So probably black was quite open. Corrupt court officials, murder, crooked custodian, grisly sigil. So first 5 cards are all black, which means that this one was probably black was being really, really open, and that's it. Yeah, black was really open and added red because there were body droppers in abundance. So there is one trophy deck from that group, and it has 4 body droppers in it, and a bunch of things that you can. It does seem a bit more controlling, but probably it's because black was so open that you get access to more removal. But yeah, I can see murder, grisly sigil, light them up. Was fatal grudge? Yeah, that's a sort of sacrifice removal. Involuntary employment also at 0.8, so that was a sort of like removal plus steal and sack plus body droppers to out tempo your opponent with things like girder goons um, and others. There's also fake your own deaths in it. So that's a very different build and quite successful, but it looks like something that doesn't come together very often. So I think that this cluster had a 7x deck, 2 1/6x deck, and 2 5x decks, probably, if I would be guessing. Okay, let's look at the next one. That's a red-green. That's actually an interesting one because well, this one was one of the poorest archetypes, so it's always good to see what made it tick, and did we all miss the good builds of it? Oh, too much. So that will be our cluster number 1, cluster number 2, cluster number 3. Oh, well, wait, I'm gonna cut it. 3. Oh, sometimes you have to overlap clusters. You can't do much about it. Cluster number 4, cluster number 5. Which, of course, the bloody IT people and their tendency of starting things with 0. My brain cannot cope with that. But okay, let's look at the cluster number 0. Okay, the top card, Jetmir's Fixer, again, because probably you want to draft red-green. When red-green is open, you will get all the Jetmir Fixers. And then bunch of Plasma Jockeys, much more than would expected from the average for the archetype. There's Antagonize in abundance. This one has only 4 wins, but we have to keep in mind that this is the poorest performing archetype. So Antagonize and Plasma Jockey are the 2 cards that are overrepresented compared to the rest. Also attended Socialite to some extent. And we have Mayhem Patrol, Strangle, Jewel Thief, Exhibition Magician as the other cards that are common. And Witty Roastmaster may be slightly overrepresented. together with the magician that generates several pings. For the family prize fight, bouncers beat down, so lots of those tricks that are depending on power, and that probably plasma jockey and jewel thief are really the only proper enablers of that, and maybe Kaldaya strong arm when it hits the table. So yeah, straight up red green, no splashes, not much fixing either that I can see. There's a couple of racer rings, but nothing really impressive. But also 4 wins is not super great. Cluster number 1, average wins 3.9. Here we have a bunch of plasma jockeys, Jetmir Fixer, Jewel Thief, Attended Socialite, Riveteers Initiate, bunch of brazen upstarts. So there must have been a white splash in those decks. I can also see there's Cabaretti Courtyard and Cabaretti Charm in many of those. So these two are uncommon. So that's basically a red-green deck that splashes for some white cards that are in triple colors. So it's you draft red-green, white is closed, but Cabaretti cards are flowing. I think that this is a type of a deck, and it has a couple of planes in each of them. So yeah, that's what we see here. And the next one, 3.1. I'm not even going to be bothered with that because 3.1 is not a high enough win rate to look what's going on in there. Cluster 3, and that's 4 wins, 4.1 wins. That's something. So let's look at that. Lots of Jetmir fixers. So again, green, red, wide open, Mayhem patrols, exhibition magicians, plasma jockeys for the family jewel thief. So that's lots of those things. There is Riveteers outlooks in abundance. So maybe some splash of black. There is Ziatora's Envoy. That's a rare, and those decks has half a copy of Ziatora's Envoy per deck. So I guess that this was drafts when you start Ziatora Envoy. Black is closed, and you just decide to go with it and splash some black. Oh, I see another deck has Obnixilis as a black splash. But yeah, these clearly are Gruul decks with the black splash. And the last cluster, 3.5 wins. I'm also not going to be bothered with that because it's just not good enough. What do we have here? 3 decks. Well, that's not much. But it looks like another red-green straight deck that just went well, maybe by chance. Who knows? Okay, what do we have next? White-green. White-green, there are some clusters here. Let's highlight this one, this one. This one probably is not good, but we'll see. And these, yeah, and these clusters look like they're sort of on the peripheries of the deck. Let's look at the first one. Okay, here we have 28 decks, average 5 wins. So that's a really good indicator. Top card, Civil Servant. You would expect that to be in the 2-color decks. For the family, Botanic Plaza, so good fixing. Broker's Hideout, good fixing. Shows you that those successful deck clusters all have an above average of fixing lands. That's something that you should maybe draw from this particular seminar, that fixing is winning you games, because I think in the current format you more frequently lose because you're not able to play your cards than because your cards are not powerful enough. Okay, you will still lose to some decks because they have more powerful cards than you, but you will probably not lose games because your deck lacks power, and you will lose more games because your deck lacks consistency. That's my opinion about it. Oh, this cluster has a good 0.7 of Disciplined Duelist, so that's splashing blue almost certainly. And in fact, do we see? Oh yeah, Broker's Hideout is there overrepresented ever so slightly. So I assume that this is just a regular green-white deck that's splashing for something blue, like Disciplined Duelist, most likely here. Disciplined Duelist, Lagrella. So that's what we can see. Those 3-colored broker cards. If again blue is not open, or you don't want to be blue, or you pick them late, but you can pick those 3-color cards. I think that's a valid strategy to splash them, because power of Disciplined Duelist and Lagrella is just enough to warrant some splash if you manage to get your hands on fixing, as most people here seem to do. What's the next cluster? 4.5 wins, 13 decks. This one doesn't have civil servant, so that's a bit strange. Maybe because there was not enough of them opened, or because there was another drafter in white green in the pod. But it has two drops and its top cards, so Civic Gardener and Ruffin's Informant. There's fixing again. Good decks have fixing. Um, Spara's Adjudicator, so that also splashes for some kind of blue, I assume. And nothing really to talk about. The rest of the cards, it's things that you will expect. One, I think, important thing is it has more Dapper Shieldmate than average deck from that color combination would have. Um, okay. Cluster 2, 3.3 wins. I'm not interested in even analyzing it. Cluster 3, 5.1 wins. Okay, that's interesting. Let's look at where is Cluster 3. It's here. So it's far away from Cluster 0, but which had a blue splash. So I assume that this one is probably the pure white-green. Let's look. Civil Servant, the top card, and a 2.3 copies on average. So it means white-green as a color combination was probably open, because 2.4 is what you would average open in per pod. So either these were the pods where there was disproportionately many Civil Servants open, or they were wheeling like crazy Ultra Draft. 2 on average of Gathering Throngs. So this is a Throng deck. If there are two copies or more, two copies on average, that probably means that there will be a bunch of the decks that have 0 and a bunch of decks that have 3, 4 of them. And say 3 Gathering Throngs. Here we have 0. 2 Gathering Throngs. Here we have 0. So yeah, there will be a subcluster in there that has a lot of Gathering Throngs, and there will be some decks in here that have 0, because it's only one card if the rest of them are more similar. Oh no! Okay, we managed to go back. What else do we have? Lots of 2-drops: Informant, Backup Agent, Civic Gardener. Then we have For the Family, Jewel Thief, Kaldaya Strong Arm. These are all cards that have at least on average one copy of each in the deck, and they're slightly overrepresented. So strong 2-drops, tricks, and powerful 3/4 drops like Jewel Thief and Kaldaya Strongarm. There is a bit more of Ceremonial Groundbreaker than you would expect by chance in those data sets. So I guess that another sign that white green was open, and there's definitely plenty of citizens that you have in your deck. You have the Civil Servant, the Throngs, Backup Agent, Civic Gardener, all of them citizens. I think Dapper Shieldmate is also a citizen, if I'm not mistaken. So you could easily equip those. But yeah, this is like a run-of-the-mill white-green deck. And the last cluster, cluster 4, should be even more white-greeny. Average 5.1 wins. So like the first one, 15 decks. Top card, Skycrier. Skycrier, and a bit fewer civil servants that you would expect. But more powerful uncommons in here. So we have average of 0.8 Ceremonial Groundbreakers, 0.7 Mages Attendants, 0.7 Citizens Crowbars. So I guess that these are the decks when you really got onto the uncommon synergies. There's 0.6 Darlings of the Masses per deck, but not so many commons, weirdly. We don't see Civic Gardeners, we don't see Backup Agents, we don't see Inspiring Overseers. So very strange cluster, to be fair. Like, how on earth did they manage to get all those good uncommons, but none good commons? And that makes me think color was not particularly open, and but they opened good cards for it, and they were able to get them. And then there might have been some problems with filling in the gaps with commons, because they were drafted by the neighbors. So that would be my guess in this particular cluster. What's happened? All right. So we went through the 2 color combinations. But let's look at some of the 3 color combinations. And unfortunately, one of them doesn't work. I can already tell you that Obscura needs updating, and it will probably happen tomorrow, but it won't happen today. So let's start with the menace of the society, the brokers, and let's see what kind of brokers deck we have. Oh, okay. So The first clusters are here. No, I'm over eager to get things. Okay, let's look at this cluster, this cluster, this cluster. Oh, there's so many of them because, of course, three-color decks are going to be slightly more complicated. This, maybe this, and maybe this, just to see out of curiosity what's going on in there. All right, I'll put this one as well. So brokers were the most winningest three-color combination, so I would expect some high win rates there. Oh, 4.1 in the cluster 0, not so much. Main card, Civil Servant, so probably more green-white tinted than anything else. Sparrow's Adjudicator, second most common card. Few brokers hideouts, so fixing was made here mainly by the taplands. I have lots of Skybridge Towers and Botanical Plazas. There's a bunch of Echoing Specters, things that you would expect, really. But there's fewer Raffine's Informants and also fewer Overseers. You don't see them on the list. So that means like forced brokers that were still good enough based on some bombs and commons and that carried it. That's what I would think this cluster is. Commons were not there, but they picked enough strong cards in the first picks to make a very useful, workable brokers deck. Okay, cluster number 2, 4.9. That's a higher win rate. And here, Broker's Hideout is the top card. So brokers were, at least you can speculate, slightly more open. Bunch of Raffine's Informants, so white, at least to some part, was open. Inspiring Overseer made the list. So again, white was at least to some extent open. And what other cards do we have here? Civil Servant, Backup Agent, Civic Gardener for the family. So again, I guess green-white tinted version of the Broker's deck, but this time commons were open. So players in here managed to get all those fancy commons. And again, in all cases, forest and plains are the most numerous basic lands, few icelands in those decks, but still enough blue cards to make it a 3-color rather than 2-color and splash deck. Next one, 4.5 wins, 10 decks. Again, top card, Jewel Thief, Civil Servant, Sparrow Adjudicator, Warm Welcome. So that's a green tinted version of the brokers. Again, we see Kaldaya Strongarm, Civic Gardener as the common top cards. So that's clearly like green tinted version when you get reliably a bunch of good green cards. There is a couple of green uncommons in there, like Courier's Briefcase, Luxurious Libation. Yeah, that's what I would guess. It's green deck that got some decent white and blue to fill it in. 4.5 wins on average, not amazing, but not bad. Cluster number 3. Let's look at the map where the cluster is. So we did 0, 1, 2. So this is the green heavy version of the broker. So if we would put those vectors on this, I mean, of course, I would do it in a formal way when I would actually calculate how the vectors line up. But I'm pretty sure that number of green cards would be a vector in this direction. This being the heaviest green. We can look at this cluster and see if it's still more green. Huh. For the family, prize, fight, tricks, Disciplined Duelist, 1.3 copies. Okay, so that's a double strike combo deck, I think, in some way. But there's a bunch of green cards, and they are all heavy on the forest. So yeah, I think that the green vector is definitely working there. Okay, number 3 is somewhere in the middle. So we would expect a balanced brokers deck with all colors roughly equal. Average wins 4.7, top card brokers hideout, Civil Servant, Sparrow's Adjudicator, Backup Agent, Caldera Strongarm, Celestial Regulator appears, which didn't appear in the previous ones. So yeah, I would guess there's Disciplined Duelist. Okay, Gathering Strong, Raffine's Informant. So slightly wide, slightly green, slightly blue. So that, just as I said, it's probably like evenly balanced. Look at the lands. 554, 554, 554, 554. So the splash in blue is larger, but it's still predominantly white green. Yeah, I love it that with data you can speculate on those kind of things. Cluster number 4, let's look where it is on the map. Cluster number 4 is sort of separate from the rest. Top cards: Paras Adjudicator, Gathering Throne, Sky Crier, Civil Servant, Overseer, Backup Agent, Broker's Hideout, Raffine's Informant. So lots of fixing, but mainly white cards. Disciplined Duelist, Speakeasy Server, Citizen Crowbar, Illuminator Virtuoso. So these are the very white decks. So if we put a vector of white, it probably will go somewhere this direction. So more white decks will be in this area. More green decks will be in this area, which leads me to guessing that this is probably where more blue decks are located. So let's look at the clusters 5 and 6. La, 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 la. Cluster 5, top card Skycrier, Gathering Throne, Raffine's Informant. But there is Majestic Metamorphosis, Illuminator Virtuoso, Inspiring Overseer. It looks very white as well. So no, I was not right. It's not the most blue card cluster in there. And cluster number 6, 4 decks, average 6 wins, Raffine's Informant. But here we have already, okay, we have Expendable Lucky as the third most common card, Lagrella the Magpie, Majestic Metamorphosis, Make Disappear. We have for fixing, we have Obscura Storm from the Skybridge Towers, things that give us blue. Chromecat. Some people love Chromecat. Hypnotic Grifter in quite high numbers. So this is like when we looked at the blue-white clusters, we saw that there was one connive cluster, and I think that this is the one, but it has a bit more green than the other ones had, so it counts as a broker deck rather than as a strict blue-white. Cluster number 7, where is that even? Okay, that's the weird one. But it has 5 average wins. Number of deck 9. Civil Servants, Paras Adjudicator, Celestial Regulator, Botanical Plaza, Skybridge Tower. So bunch of fixing quite high. Like out of the top 6 cards in those decks, 4 are fixing of some sorts. And then we have Run Out of Town, Civic Gardener, Echo Inspector, Metamorphosis, so all the good cards in the format. So basically another version of the balanced 3-color decks. And that's basically it. Because cluster 8 has 3 decks. We already looked at those. Okay, I'll skip Obscura because I'll show you why. We uploaded the wrong data file for that. I redid the analysis, but it was not updated yet. So we won't be able to draw any conclusions because the dots are in the wrong place, or the win rates are actually in the wrong place. Shame. Okay, Maestros. We have, well, 3 very clear clusters. I think that this one, number 1, number 2, 1 on the side here. Well, maybe let's make a smaller one here, here, and here. Then let's see what's cooking in there. Okay. 23 decks, average 5 wins. Bunch of snooping newsies, Glamorous Outlaws, Waterfront District, Maestros, Theater, Corpse Surpriser at 1 copy. So basically, that's my strategy. If I want to have a Corpse Surpriser when I play Maestros, that's it. We have Girder, Goons, Cricket Custodian, Corrupt, Court Official, so maybe slightly more black tinted. There's also Murder, Make Disappear in those decks. Cormila, Expendable Lucky, Maestros Charm. I guess it also, like, the strength of Maestros was that a lot of time you get those Maestros 3-color cards that are quite powerful, but you need to be in Maestros to use them. So if you were in the right spot and got a couple of decent black cards, some blue, and then started wheeling those 3-color cards, you were in a good spot there. Cluster number 1, average 5.4 wins, so that's a very strong cluster. And we see the same cards. On top, Snooping Newsy and Glamorous Outlaw. But here we have Girder Goons, Echo Inspector, Make Disappear, Corpse Surpriser, again, a lot of copies of that. So you really want to have the Corpse Surpriser when you played Maestros. But this one looks more like blue-black tinted and maybe with splashing red for those 3-color cards. Because we see, again, Corpse Surpriser, Maestro's Charm as the red spells, but we don't see anything strictly red being in those top cards here. And I think that that was partially the way to play Maestros, when you had like a blue-black and you added some red good card, 3-color cards. Cluster number 2, 4.5 wins. Top cards are Tramway Station and Maestro Theater, so people did like their fixing. That's good. Make Disappear then and Corpse Surpriser, and higher than Snooping Newsies. So there were more Corpse Surprisers in those decks than Snooping Newsies, which means that blue-black probably was not open and not like super strongly promoted, but still based on the quality of the 3-color cards probably it got there. Weird. Backstreet Bruiser is also making the cut, so sort of like a 3/3 wall basically. So you wanted to go to some kind of a late game with those decks and kill people somehow. But how? Oh. By bombs. That's the answer. I see that there's an Evelyn here. Sanguine Spy. Okay, so basically the chassis of those decks was not particularly strong. They are more blue than anything else because they all had island as the most common land, for at least the trophy versions of them. And it was sort of controlish, I would say, this particular cluster. Okay, cluster number 3, 5 wins on average. Top card, Tramway Station, Corrupt Court Official, Clamorous Outlaw, Murder, Maestro's Theater, Corpse Surpriser, Crooked Custodian, Body Dropper. So this is probably because there is no Snooping Newsy. This is more the black-red version with a slightly more blue. And that's what it more or less looks like from the lists. That this one was based on having a bit more black red and then getting hooked up with some of the good blue cards and adding them to your deck because you prioritized fixing and you could do that. And is that the last 2 clusters? Maestro's Theater, Body Dropper, Corpse Surpriser. And you see that I told you that uncommons are less prevalent, so you should not be seeing many of them in those deck lists. But all of the Maestro's decks had a corporate pricer on average of between 0.8 and 1 point something. So definitely people went in to draft Maestros because they had access to that corpse pricer. Maybe they started black-red, they saw an uppriser, picked it, and decided to add a couple of more blue cards. Maybe they picked uppriser early and then started drafting Maestros, or maybe you were in the blue-black color combination and then Corpse Surpriser appeared in the pack. They picked it and they started positioning themselves towards playing Maestros because Corpse Surpriser on its own is just so powerful that it's worth adding that extra color. And as I said, that here we have the last cluster with 4.5 average wins. That doesn't have Corpse Surpriser, but it has a bunch of Body Dropper Girder Goons. So we're talking about the black-red deck that splashes for some things, probably on a higher rarity level there. So this one has 2 Cormellas, bunch of spells, Evelyn. So basically the splash was for this sort of vampire package. Here again we have Cormella from blue spells. Undercover operative. So they're basically splashing blue for bombs. Oh, this one has 2 Corpse Appraisers as well. So just enough blue to warrant being called Maestro's decks, but it's usually a small blue splash in these. All right. What else do we have? Cabaretti. Oh, that looks a bit dodgy. I think this one is the same problem as the Obscura. So let's look at the last one, and that's River Tears, also known River of Tears if you have to draft it. I think this is going to have 2 mega clusters, and I'm just going to go through that like this. I need to update also Cabaretti then. Oh, shame on me. Okay, 4 wins based on 33 decks. Body Dropper, Girder, Goons, Riveteers, Outlook. I think that this one is going to be, again, a black-red deck that splashes some green for decent cards like Jewel Thief or, well, basically Jewel Thief and looking from this list. So, wow, 4 Body Droppers. If you play more Body Droppers than Mountains, or, well, actually equal number of Body Droppers and Mountains, that fixing better be good. But yeah, I think that this cluster is clearly a black-red deck that splashes a bit more of the green, probably on the higher rarities again. And this one is definitely a green-red deck that splashes probably black for some good stuff, because the top card is Jetmir's Fixer, the second top card is Jewel Thief, there's the Riveteer's Outlook, and then from black cards we see Girder, Goons, and some 3-colored cards. So 2 different flavors of Riveteers, one focusing on the black red, one focusing on the green red. The green red has a much lower win rate, so I don't know if it's worth it. But okay, this is the Archetypist. I hope that you did enjoy looking through it, and hopefully you can explore it a bit on your own. I'll try to update it in the next couple of days to have all the archetypes properly represented. I know that Obscura is already done properly, it's just not uploaded yet. And I have to redo the Cabaretti because there's definitely something wrong in there. And with that, I can go back to my presentation. Stop share. Oh, okay. Chrome tab. I can go to my presentation. You can see my presentation again, and I can do the acknowledgement. So thanks to all the 17 Lens team who are always well, very, very helpful to me and well, to all of us. So if you have some cash burn in your pocket, I would highly recommend supporting their Patreon. And obviously, huge thanks to Pekka Pulli for helping me with the Archetypist, developing the tool, making it so easy to use and read. And at the same time, thanks to Fake Jake Brown, who is the person that is helping me to release it in the podcast form. And while we are on the topic of the podcast form, thanks to SSQ and Mana Junkie for the music I'm using in the podcast form. And with that, I'll see you in 4-5 days when I will have a special guest on the pod to analyze how that special guest fared in the streets of New Capena and what were the successful cards for that guest. I'm not going to say who it is yet, so you have to figure it out on the 3rd. And also a reminder to everyone that on the 4th, we're going to run our skeleton archetypes with Sandra Kirstens, Jason ILTG, and the Jordan, and we're going to talk about how would we build our decks in that particular format. So until then, bye.